Here we go. I send greetings from New York. I'm at Syracuse University, as my slide tells you. We are about a 4-hour drive northwest of New York City. This is a picture of our beautiful campus. I wish I could be in Tokyo. I had planned to come, but other travel preventing me from coming over there. But I do send my greetings, and I also want to acknowledge my two co-authors, Wencheng Chang and Ying Xu, both of whom are graduate students in my university. I represent the departments of sociology and also human development and family science, as do my students. What I'm going to talk about today is filial piety, which is a very strong normative belief system coming out of Confucius thought within most, if not all, Asian countries. I say discontents because I think filial piety is going through transition or transformation right now. And this idea that children are going to be serving and serving happily their elderly parents is somehow in decline, and there's quite a bit of concern about this issue. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is review some of the big changes that have occurred in China, especially rural China, and then examine how parents see their children as performing their filial duties, and what factors might be responsible for the strength of that evaluation. So I'm going to start with, let's see. Here we go. Just some headlines that I come across. These are all from the New York Times, which is my kind of go-to newspaper. And I'm just going to move my bar here. Oh, maybe I can't. Anyway, you can see the top slide. I can't read it, but what you're seeing here are headlines about China's demographic transition in terms of the reduction of fertility, the shortage of young people, the shortage coming up of young adults, and the proportionate increase of the older population. So this is being framed as a crisis, as a catastrophe, as a great warning for China in many ways, but I'm going to focus here on the impact that it might have on the older population and the role of the family in support of older adults. As you might know, China's one-child policy has been eradicated, turned into a two-child policy, then a three-child policy, and for all intents and purposes, there's really no limit on family size so much anymore, but family size continues to drop, continues to fall, as people have fewer and fewer children with fewer resources potentially to care for the older people in that society. So at the micro level, population aging means a family structure where there are many more older people in the family than there are middle-aged and young people. So this gives you kind of this triangular shape. Some people might call this kind of a pyramidal shape at the population level, where you have many older people in the population and relatively few younger people. What this means at the family level is that there may be one adult child, maybe two, providing support for his or her parents and maybe even their grandparents. So this puts a lot of pressure on the children to provide care and support upward to the older generation that tend to be more numerous than they may be able to cope with. Here you see the young child, the little prince, who is being doted on by the older generation. So you kind of see a very dramatic change in the family dynamics in this sort of family structure. So the big concern for this, of course, is whether that little baby in the picture will grow up to be a young adult who is now caring for maybe up to 6 individuals in the older generation. So the questions about filial piety is particularly acute in rural China, although it's changed in urban China for sure. But modernization in rural China is perhaps right now more rapid because of the changes that have occurred in China. Rural China is sort of beginning to catch up. Rural China is also still largely culturally traditional. That is, they have strong beliefs in family support, in filial obligation and responsibility. But the change is quite substantial in terms of reduced family size, migration into the cities from these rural villages, as well as children's increased education and their economic mobility, kind of putting strains and stretching the family in ways that the culture really has no experience with. So you have what might be called a cultural tradition bumping up against these kind of structural and large-scale changes that have separated families and reduced their ability to perform their culturally traditional roles. So one of the big questions, and I won't be able to answer this in this particular talk, is whether filial piety is weakening or declining, changing shape. That is, maybe filial piety exists, but the obligations toward older people have changed, or has it become increasingly irrelevant as China modernizes in contemporary times? The other question I'm going to be looking at more directly is, what are the factors that contribute to children fulfilling their filial expectations in terms of the time and money transfers they might provide to the older generation? When I say time transfers, I mean help and support and caregiving. By money transfers is simply the economic provision of monetary resources to the older generation. So we know that adult children are obligated to provide care and cash. So care and cash, meaning time and money, to their older parents. But at filial piety, the responsibility to do these things are now changing or reducing. What are the implications in rural China for this kind of change? And who are the children who are reducing their filial concern? And what are the factors that may compensate for that? So that's going to be more or less the topic of what I'll be talking about. So there are filial pressures that changes in China have enacted on adult children with implications for their older parents. Again, I mentioned that these changes have challenged the duty to provide care and support to older parents with fewer siblings. We also know that migration is very high in China, migration from rural to urban sectors. Working age adults with families of their own may move within China, creating challenges to fulfill their traditional family roles with respect to their older parents in their native villages. We also know that there's a preference for sons, which is still dominant in China, especially in rural China. So what happens when families only have daughters? They're going to step up and provide care for their older parents in need. Also in China, there's fairly limited availability of long-term care services, as well as social assistance to care for older people, which puts a lot of burden on intergenerational sources, particularly adult children and sometimes grandchildren, about which I've done some research. But we do know that the bulk of care, the bulk of support is not coming from the government, it's coming from children. And this includes financial support as well. Pensions have come to China. They're universal in some fashion, but they're relatively low. And in rural China, they're almost unlivable. That is, a pension is not going to support any person in a reasonable way. And children have to fill the gap in the financial, for the financial benefit of their parents. So what is filial piety? In English terms, I know this is very much well understood in Asian cultures. But in English terms, and I take this from a colleague, Professor Sung from South Korea, he has a very succinct, direct definition. Filial piety consists in the practice of filial respect and care to parents, which has been a normative duty and obligation of adult children in Asian societies. So respect and care seems to entail both attitude, right? Having respect is an attitude, is a way of demonstrating your concern for your parents, and care is kind of the physical manifestation of that. That's the behavioral aspect of it. And it's become a normative duty that it is woven into the fabric of cultural expectations, and it's an obligation that children feel that they should provide. So this includes rules and conduct about material support, as providing money, providing housing, and providing services, all delivered with a sense of what's called spiritual devotion. So how you provide that care is also very important. Filial piety symbol is a combination of the character for old and the character for son. So the images of an older person being carried by a son. And this indicates the older generation should be supported by the younger generation, but particularly the son in this patrilineal society. So I went back to look at some translations of what Confucius wrote in terms of filial piety, because he is kind of, you might say, the intellectual, philosophical originator of the term and what it means. And I'm just going to show you some quotes that I took kind of because they were very evocative for me. In caring for parents, children should make them feel happy, not act against their will, let them see and hear pleasurable things, provide them with comfortable places to sleep. Well, that's a very altruistic view of filial piety. In the morning, they should ask their parents in a gentle voice if their clothes are warm enough and if they have any pain or discomfort. And if they do, they should be given proper care and relief of discomfort. So you kind of see here, this is just one bit of a lot of obligations that are itemized within Confucius' writings, but it tells parents exactly what they need to do. That is, provide for the parents, but do it in a way that provides the parents pleasure, provides them with comfort, a gentle voice, meaning doing it with a good attitude, right? A kind manner. These are very much embedded within filial piety. So it's not just about providing support. Nursing home can do that, but children are usually the only ones who will do it in the way that's prescribed by Confucius and his prescription about what filial piety involves. Another quote, which I'm going to draw on here in the research I'll present, is about children who move away from their parents. And Confucius says, while your parents are alive, it is better not to travel far away. But he gives you an out. If you do travel, you should have a precise destination. Now, what does that mean? Well, you can interpret this in various ways. I provide some of the Chinese characters for those who can read that. A precise destination implies some sort of intentionality. Right? It's not just moving for your own sake or moving at random. It's an intentional move to a particular place for a particular purpose. And often, maybe most often, it has to do with ensuring the well-being of one's family. And what does that involve? What often involves providing money back to the parents who you've left, right? Or supporting the siblings who are taking care of your parents, right? So it has to do, in that term, it has to do with a kind of movement that allows children then to still provide for their parents in ways that may be different from when they lived nearby, but provide for them nevertheless. Filial piety has also been encoded in Chinese law, the protection of the rights and interests of elderly people, passed in 2013. And it stipulates that family members living apart from the elderly should frequently visit or send greetings to elderly persons. So this is a rough translation, of course. And below here in the picture, you see a son being brought up on charges that he ignored his mother. This was a warning, I think, to show that the state, the government, was taking a keen interest in the responsibility of adult children to care for their parents. And the cynical person might say the part of the reason for this passage of the law was that the government wants families to take care of their own family members, their own older adults, because they don't want to provide formal care, government support, pension and social services to this growing older population because it is so expensive. So the longer the families continue to take care and visit their older parents and make sure that they're safe and sound, allows the government to avoid that cost. Excuse me. So we know filial piety is important, but there's been a variety of studies showing that it actually impacts on the well-being of older people. As is perceived by older parents, if older parents perceive that their children are not being filial, it has negative consequences to their depression, loneliness, their self-rated health tends to be poorer, and they experience greater stress. And this is especially true when older parents have high expectations and the children are perceived as not fulfilling them. So filial piety is important as a cultural aspect of life. It's also important in terms of how it's received in terms of the well-being of older people and what those expectations of parents are relative to what the children are perceived as providing to them. So filial piety is an interesting concept. Of course, it's an Eastern concept that comes, I mentioned, out of Confucian thought. And this is kind of a concept, I guess you could say, or an aspect of family life that complements the kind of models we generally use to discuss family relationships across generations, what we call cohesion, in the Vern Bankson model, who is the leading scholar in the intergenerational solidarity theory, or the formation of intergenerational solidarity theory. And the dimensions of solidarity, that is, the elements that bind family members together, have to do with the emotional closeness that family members feel toward each other, or affection, the amount of contact they have with each other, how close they live to each other, proximity, how often they agree with each other, or consensus, the amount of help and support that are exchanged both to and from older people in the family, and norms of filial obligation. Generally, when obligation is mentioned in the Western model, it's often what I call generalized, that it's not relationship specific. That is, it's usually asked, should children provide for their older parents, rather than how do you think your child is providing for you, and are they doing a good job doing it? And are they meeting your expectations? This gets much more to the relationship level, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. So this idea of filial piety is both a normative belief. It's also something that plays out at the individual relationship level, which is what I'll be talking about here. I can talk about the other two, but this is the focus of this particular research that I'm presenting. So we call this kind of a culture gap in the Western family literature. Of course, this is covered in several articles in Western journals, but it's also mostly covered in Asian journals. That is, cultural attitudes toward filial responsibility, which in the case of filial piety includes respect, deference, which means giving your parents the right to control your life in some way, veneration, that is parents representing kind of the ancestors that have long been deceased, providing service, and being obedient to your parents, right? And this is something you don't see much in Western literature. So filial piety gives a different kind of conceptual take on what it means for families to be cohesive. What I'm going to look at is evaluative assessments from the parents of whether children are perceived as being filial, of meeting their filial expectations. And we know this is very strongly culturally defined. We see this in Western literature sometimes, in African-American families, such as Peggy Dilworth Anderson's work on cultural justification for caregiving, which is very much embedded in African-American cultures. The cultural dictates of families care first and society cares second. And I would also say that the measures of filial piety that I just spoke about are usually global when they're measured at all, and they cover all children in a family rather than individual relationships. That is, with your sons, with your daughters, with each individual person, rather than all your children together. Which way we can kind of look at the variation across children within the family if we take a relational perspective. So in terms of the Great Migration in China, this is just giving you kind of a very short snapshot of migration behavior in China. What you see is an increase in the urban population going from 200 million just below in 1950 to 100 years later to over 1 million. And then you see a corresponding increase followed by a very strong decrease in the rural population with a crossover somewhere around now. So China is transforming into an urban society, coming fairly late in terms of what we might call as a middle income, somewhat developed country. But that is really accelerating now, largely due to migration from rural areas and the transformation of rural areas into urban areas as a policy of the Chinese government. So labor markets in the urban areas have attracted rural dwellers, rural working age adults who move from their native villages, usually to get higher wages. Some people estimate rural workers can earn up to 3 times as much by moving and taking jobs in urban locations. What we also know from this movement is that co-residence with children by older people, which is, we know, an overt demonstration of filial piety, right? It's a way to demonstrate it, is in decline. There are fewer older people living with their children, not only due to migration, but smaller family size. And we know that the impact of distance may not be positive, it may be negative. That is, filial piety may be perceived to be at risk among children who have moved away. But we maintain in this presentation, and I'll show you the results in a few minutes, that this reduction in filial piety may be compensated by distant children providing money, or older people receiving money from those distant children, as well as receiving some form of social or instrumental support from those distant children from time to time, as well as older adults providing care for grandchildren. So in some ways, family ties can be maintained even with those kind of distances that migration involves. We also maintain that norms of filial responsibility to serve the health-related needs of older parents may weaken the perception of distant children as being filial. That is, older people with very high needs, very high levels of disability, may need to live with their adult children, and those distant children may be seen as less than filial because they're not living with those parents who are in greatest need. So I hope these kind of hypotheses, as it were, are making sense. I'm going through it relatively quickly. So the data set I'm going to show you about is the longitudinal study of older adults in Anhui Province, China. It's a random sample of about 1,800 older adults, 60 and over, started in 2001, with replenishment going through 2021. This was a random sample in rural villages within the Chaohu region of Anhui Province. On the left, you see Anhui Province in red. It's kind of not coastal, but eastern province. And then on the right, you see the province itself with the sampling area in red on the Yangtze River. So that's where we did our sampling. There's a lot to be said about this area, but it's fairly representative of, I think, rural China. It has high rates of migration, which I'll show you in a few minutes. Well, I'll show you right now. So these are the migration streams in China, and you can see that they're pretty much going to the east coast of China, where most of the jobs and economic development has taken place and still takes place. What you can see, if you can read the word Anhui, it's sort of in the middle of the country, a little bit south, close to the eastern border or the eastern coast. And you see some of those thick lines moving from Anhui to Shanghai. And you don't see Nanjing here, but that's another destination. So we chose this area because it had relatively high rates of migration. We started this 2001. I'm going to talk about the data from 2021, where we added new measures of filial piety. So what I'm going to look at here is about 1,500 older parents, 60 and over, and their relationships with almost 4,000 adult children who are 16 and over in 2021. So the parents of the sampling units, and we're going to talk about their, I'm going to talk about their relationship with their children from the parents' point of view. The children are not in the study. So filial piety, we spent a long time trying to figure out how to evaluate it with a single question, and it turns out to be fairly simple. You see it in the Chinese translation, but we ask, how filial is this child to you? And we ask this about each child that each parent in the sample has, minimal, a little bit, average, above average, or very much filial. So it's a global perception of that particular child, however they are looked at as being filial to the parent. So the question we ask, one of the questions is, do exchanges, that is transfers received from distant children, level up, that is increase the perceived filial piety to the same level, the same filial piety that co-resident children are perceived as having, right? We know that co-resident children have the strongest perception of being filial to the parent, but can distant children make up for it by providing various forms of support to their parents to make up for the fact that they're far away? And how do they provide support? One way is by providing money. So we measured the amount of money received from each child in the last year, and we take the log of that to reduce skewness. We also ask about the amount of instrumental support that each child provides, that is housework, assistance, and personal care that's received from each child. So our idea here is that receiving money and receiving support from distant children will increase the perception that they are being filial. Otherwise, they are seen as sort of abandoning their responsibility. We also looked at health of the parent. That is, we proposed that parents with greater need, that greater disability, greater health problems, would more weakly evaluate the filial piety of their children who are far away, because obviously children who are far away can't tend to the needs of those disabled parents. And they're seen as less filial than those who are living with them or maybe even close to them. So we measured filial limitations, functional limitations with 15 items. I'm going to show you just some of them: the difficulty in performing following tasks, preparing food, doing shopping, doing housework, walking 100 meters, difficulty bathing, and difficulty dressing. So we add up the 15 items on a 3-point scale. So that goes from 0 to 45, which tells us something about the limitations and the functional impairments that these older parents are facing. So the method we use is a random effects ordinal logistic regression with clustering, and this maybe means something to some of you, and maybe it doesn't mean anything to others, but basically it's a way of kind of predicting filial piety from the distance that children live, as well as the kind of support that they provide and the health of the parent. So we're basically trying to come up with a predictive model to see which children are perceived as being more filial and what those predictors are. We use something called internal moderation to look at contrast in the amount of money and the amount of support provided by various distance categories to see if at what point filial piety of the distant children approaches that of co-resident children, right? At what point in the transfers that they provide allow distant children to be seen as filial as co-resident children. So the control variables we include are gender, occupation, education, marital status, age, and age of parents and children. So for those of you who like to see numbers, these are the odds ratios predicting the evaluation of filial piety of these 4,000 children. And we look at parent characteristics as well as children characteristics. The odds ratios above 1 mean a positive relationship, below 1 a negative relationship. And here you see mothers are more likely to evaluate stronger filial piety of their children than fathers. Parents who have more functional limitations or more impaired evaluate their children's filial piety as weaker. Those who have stronger filial norms overall evaluate their individual children as being more filial, which makes some sense. Daughters are perceived as being more filial than sons. Younger children is perceived as being more filial than older children. Married children are perceived as more filial than unmarried children, which makes sense. They would be more family-oriented in their own lives. And here you see education. Higher educated children tend to be perceived as being more filial, which is interesting, but they probably have the resources that they can provide to their children. And what's interesting here in terms of distance, you see that those children who live in the same village or beyond the village of the parent are seen as less filial than those who live with their parents. So living with parents produces a higher evaluation, a stronger evaluation of filial piety than children who live outside the household, either in the same village or beyond the village. You see those odds ratios well below 1. We see that children who provide more money perceived as more filial overall, as well as children who provide more support to their parents. So all these relationships seem to make sense and are kind of conform to theoretical expectations about when children are seen as filial and the kind of conditions the parents are experiencing, which also relate to their evaluations of the children themselves. So I'm going to focus in here in the next stage of the presentation on geographic distance and health and resources. So we kind of convert this model into a set of probabilities, which we're going to be looking at as the proportion the probability that his child is evaluated as being above average or very filial, right? So it's basically simplifying things to kind of come up with just a single proportion of being average or very filial, above average or very filial versus below average or not at all filial. And then we're going to look at interactions for the functional limitations, instrumental support, and money received with geographic distance to see if there's compensation going on. I know this sounds confusing. There's a lot going on here, and I will show you some figures that kind of show you the relationships that we are testing. This is the first one. So again, we're looking at a predicted value of those who evaluated their children as being above average or very filial. So this is at the higher end. And I'm showing you three different conditions: when the child lives with the parent, when the child is in the same town, in the same village, that's the red line. And then the green line is those who live in the same town or further, or basically beyond the village. And what you see here is basically a flat line for functional limitations of the parent in terms of the evaluation of filial piety. But if you look at those who live with their parents, right, then those children are evaluated as more filial, the less healthy the parent is. So if you look at the kind of the right side of this figure, and you see these, the most impaired parents, right, this is where you see the big difference. So among the most impaired parents, living with a child produces a higher probability, much higher probability of evaluating that child as filial compared to those children who are living apart, right? So there's something about living with an impaired parent that really strengthens the sense that that child is responsible for the parent. Now I'm going to show you the interactions for instrumental support and for the receipt of money from children, because we think those might be compensatory in terms of geographic distance. So here again, living together is by definition a flat line, because we did not ask instrumental support for those who lived with the parent. So basically, it's the average across all values here. So what you do see here is among children who are living apart from their parents, either in the same village or beyond the village, the green and the red line, you see a steady increase in the evaluation of filial piety as the support they provide goes up, right? So there's some compensation, you might call it a convergence at the high end of support, where those kids who are providing instrumental support at the highest level are evaluated as having the same filial responsibility, the same filial piety as those children who live with their parents. So there's some compensation going on, we kind of see this in a statistical interaction, which is significant, and these are the predicted values from those interactions. The next thing is about money. So this is time. We're looking at time and money, right? So providing support is time and effort, and we're going to look at money. So money gives you a much more dramatic story. Again, you see the red line, which is flat, which is about money from children, which is again an average across all. The filial piety is the same across all levels of money provided from children. And what you see here is among among children who live apart from their parents, either in the same village or beyond the village, those who provide no money or very little money are the ones who are evaluated as significantly less filial. And as money tends to increase, those distant children come to be seen as more filial, up to the point, at the maximum point of filial, of economic support, you see a convergence with the co-resident child, right? So we're seeing that providing more money compensates for the geographic distance in terms of how that child is perceived as being filial. So I hope this makes sense. We're seeing an interaction, a way that children then can kind of leverage the distance between them and their parents with the economic support that they can provide. So let me sum this up. Filial piety in China is still relatively strong. I didn't show you the averages here, but most people are out of the 5-category filial piety scale. 80% are in the 2 highest categories. But it does vary significantly across children, depending on their social characteristics, especially their geographic distance. So children who live farther away perceived as less than filial, but that can be overcome or compensated for by the children's provision of support, both instrumental and financial. The idea that Confucius talked about moving away should be traveling well, right, to a precise destination, perhaps, involves intentionality and keeping flows of support active, keeping communication open. That is, moving away is still permissible in the context of Confucian thought if it has the kind of intentionality that involves family support and the guarantee of family well-being, especially as it relates to the older generation. We also saw that older parents with health problems view their co-resident children as the most filial. That is, they're recognizing the importance of the presence of adult children as fulfilling their cultural duty during periods of their own vulnerability and need, right, as indicated by higher functional disability. So some limitations of this study, we know that filial piety perceptions may influence decisions about which children may be selected for caregiving and to stay close, and which children would be predisposed to migrate, right? So providing kind of the encouragement or even the financial support, which we found to migrant children to help them establish themselves in urban locations is not unusual. And older parents are not passive in the process. They're active. They're actors in sort of arranging or helping to shape the kind of support system they might need by influencing which children may stay to do care and which children may decide to move. So in some ways, you can kind of think of this as a family decision in which older parents have some input, right? So I think it's not maybe a mistake to think of the children as moving on their own volition, but agreeing to move as a family decision to maximize the well-being of the whole family system, which we found to be the case in other research we've done on this sample. Other dimensions of intergenerational solidarity and cohesion may also be important in addition to filial piety, such as the affection or emotional closeness. We might think that children who are less close to their parents emotionally would be more likely to move. Those who have more conflict with their parents, more likely to move. Those who maybe don't see the importance of having contact with parents, more likely to move. So we know that filial piety may be something like a pre-established condition that sensitizes kids to move or not move, depending on the nature of the relationship they have. And then the last thing I'll say is we did this survey in 2021 during the COVID-19 pandemic and some of the lockdowns. We did the survey kind of in between lockdowns. We were very fortunate to get into the field. This was post-vaccine, but still a very sensitive time in China. And we don't know what effect that may have on perceptions of filial piety. And we hope to ask these same questions in our 2024 survey, which we are planning for the end of this summer. So just in a general conclusion, I would say that our results speak to the adaptable nature of filial piety, especially in modern Chinese society when migration pressures on the younger generation, especially in rural China, are causing quite deep concern about the viability of intergenerational support for older parents. As I mentioned in the beginning of this talk, adult children are critical for the maintenance, right, of the lives of older people, the very survival of older parents in terms of their economic well-being, but I would also say their physical well-being and their social well-being. That has not changed all that much. I think the day may come when China institutes a more formal long-term care policy, a more institutionalized long-term care policy, such as the kind that Japan, that South Korea have, which takes some of the burden, some of the pressure off of children. But for now, we see that children are kind of the first line of defense for older parents. And that filial piety is kind of keeping children kind of chained in a way to their parents, and their ability to provide for care may be threatened by geographic mobility, but they're still issuing those remittances to the parents. They're still providing some support and conforming to the rules and the dictates of filial piety. It's still very much a strong part and fabric of Chinese society today, in spite of the large-scale changes that have occurred. So future research is I won't go into all of this, is to link filial piety as well as filial expectations of parents to well-being outcomes, which we know in the literature has been related to depression, life satisfaction, loneliness, sense of control. We also found filial piety related to death anxiety, so that people afraid of how and when they're going to die and what's going to happen to them at the end of life is somehow alleviated by having filial children. And we all know that old age optimism, that is seeing old age as a positive part of life, is related to filial piety because people feel that their needs will be taken care of. They have a heightened sense of security in the case of knowing their children will conform to these cultural rules. How is filial piety related to the concept of resilience, which we see a lot in gerontology, that is the ability to adapt after a serious event, such as a health crisis or the loss of a spouse or partner? We don't know all that much about how filial piety as an internal resource may buffer the impact of those serious events. And the last thing I'll say, and this is something we've been working on, and I hope to present this in another meeting later this year, is about regional variation in filial piety as it relates to level of development. We did our sampling in 16 different villages in the Chaohu region, but we know from some of our data collection that there's been uneven economic and social development in those villages. And what we want to do is then compare villages that have developed more rapidly than others to see if filial piety is stronger or weaker in those villages and what the consequences might be for their outcomes. So I want to thank the funding agency or agencies for this research. Foremost are two listed here: the National Natural Science Foundation of China, which funded the last few waves of data collection, and the Fogarty International Center of the National Institutes of Health, which funded the first two waves. I would also say that our data, at least our first two waves, and we're hoping to provide more, are sitting in the NACDA, National Archive of Computerized Datasets on Aging archive. And we've been working with them on other projects as well. And we hope to continue archiving our data with them for years to come. And then I want to give special thanks to Professor Li Shuzhou and his research team at Xianjiao Tong University for their collaboration and their essential contribution to the data infrastructure and data collection of this project, as well as their collegiality in writing articles and co-authoring research papers together. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much for the great presentation, Mr. Silverstein. So now we have 1 minute left for Q&A, a few minutes left for Q&A. So if you have any question, please write in the chat box. Mr. Silverstein, can you look at the question?
Yeah, I see that question. Is the aim to make predictions about what this might mean for elder care in the future? Yes, I think the idea here is to be kind of forward thinking about what this might mean in terms of the kind of the transformation of care for older adults in light of hyper migration and smaller family size. We hope to be able to kind of compare larger and smaller families, with different characteristics to kind of use those as a way to forecast into the future what the changing shape of a family might be for these sorts of activities and these sorts of supportive roles that children play. So we hope with some longitudinal data, we might be able to actually look at change itself, because this was the first wave. We put these very specific questions on the survey, but we're hoping we're able to see and detect some kind of change if there's a decline in the perceptions of filial piety and what those what the reasons for that decline might be.
Thank you for question and answer. Does anybody have more question? Okay, you can ask a follow-up question with me.
Okay, well, thank you for listening. I guess I don't know, Edgar Eslet, did you have a question from the Philippines?
He's a presenter.
Oh, I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Sorry, I can hear. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, okay. So is there any more question? You can write in the chat box. Or if you want to speak up, you can talk through the mic for your question.
I see Ruth responded, or no?
Anybody have questions?
I mean, I will just say briefly that we're planning a survey 2024. I'm going to visit China for the first time since 2019. I'm sorry, I heard, was that it? Somebody ask a question? Oh, do you have a sense of whether the Chinese government is aware and concerned? Oh, yes, very much so. The question was, do you have a sense of whether the Chinese government is aware and concerned of this issue? Very much so. There's been kind of a resurgence of kind of Confucian education, let's call it, in China to reinforce what they perceive as kind of a weakening of filial piety. Again, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, there's concern that what the family does not provide, the government will have to. And given the relative size of the older population with reduced fertility, that could come at a very high cost to Chinese society. So I think there's a sense of trying to reinforce, and this is also overlaps with a kind of return to traditionalism in China. And maybe you might even say it overlaps with a certain amount of nationalism and return to kind of cultural traditions, which we're seeing in the current regime within China. But the Chinese government, I think, has a very strong interest economically in trying to promote filial piety and keep the family on board as long as possible. Whether, again, pensions start rising and becoming more reasonable to live on and freeing children of that economic obligation, or whether, long-term care, both at home and in institutions, becomes more institutionalized within the society. I think it's going to happen eventually, but it's going to come at a cost, and that so that I think the Chinese government is trying to forestall this as long as possible. That's a very good question.
Question and answer. Does anybody else have any more questions?
So do you understand that the term basically just not on this section? Do you have any doubts? Oh, okay. So.
So now time has come, so we have run out of time for this session. So can
Okay.
we move on to next session? No,
Okay.
no, before next session, we're gonna have some few minutes of break time. So thank you very much, everybody, for your question, the answer, and
Yeah.
for the great presentation, Mr. Silverstein. Thank you very much,
Okay.
everybody.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
So we're going, let's see in the next session.